Okay, let me just. Okay, can you now see the screen?
Yeah, it works.
Okay, great. So hello everyone. Welcome to our MindRL Hub, research recap activity. So as a tradition, we first need to introduce our committee member. So this time we have a new committee member, Hao Yizhang from University of Toronto, join us. So now we have 5 committee members. They are from Zhe Fang from Shanghai Jiao Tong University, Huai Yuliu, which is Ted from UCL, Yanan Liu, who is from McGill University, and me from Georgia Tech, and the new member Hao Yizhang from University of Toronto. So we set up this platform in order to provide a platform for researchers to communicate and collaborate. So we just, like the diagram in the reinforcement learning. So we welcome peers from fields such as psychology, cognitive neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and other related disciplines, such as mathematics, management, and economics, to build a more diverse and inclusive platform. We have a diverse form of activities. Research recap is we invited some scholars who speak about their published papers. And we also have journal jam, which is like journal club that we have some members to introduce papers by others, or some book breakdown or tutorial talk or tour time, which is more about the foundations of our RL and some of the methods and code practices. Oh, to notice that we're actually preparing for a reinforcement learning tutorial in the next upcoming weeks. So please stay tuned about the WeChat group and also about MindRL Google group. Every time you can just attend by Zoom or Teams meetings, we will just send out the notifications through Twitter, website, and GitHub page, and also WeChat community. You can also always watch archive talks in our GitHub page. So today it's my great honor to introduce our speaker, Marcel Binz from Institute of Human-Centered AI at Helmholtz Munich, to introduce his most recent work about using large language models to build the foundation models of human cognition. So Marcel employs computational models to uncover the fundamental principles behind the human cognition. He believes that for a more complete understanding of human cognition, they must consider the human mind as a whole. So he uses a lot of tools such as neural networks, Bayesian inference, meta-learning, information theory, and large language models. So Marcel Binz is also, I believe, is one of the pioneers who use large language models to understand the cognitive psychology, of machines, which is they call now like machine psychology. So I believe Marcel will share us a lot of tremendous insights about how we can finally use large language models to understand the cognition of both humans and machines. So now let me just turn the microphone to Marcel.
Perfect. Thanks for the kind introduction. Let me see, share screen. So this works, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, thanks for the kind introduction. Happy to be here. So I will talk about foundation models of human cognition today. Actually, adjust my microphone. So I should say, I said it before, but I want to say it again. If you have questions in the talk, feel free to interrupt me, especially for clarification questions. If something is unclear or so, I'm happy to clarify right away. So yeah, back in 2016, I think it was, Google DeepMind has really shocked the world, as many of you probably know, with the release of a system called AlphaGo. This was really the first computer program that was able to play the board game of Go at the superhuman level. And back then, that was really considered a milestone in artificial intelligence engineering, especially considering that it was predicted by many experts that it would take many years until we have a computer system that could beat the best players in the world at this particular game. Now, while that was an amazing engineering achievement, AlphaGo was still an expert system, right? It was only able to play the game of Go, but couldn't do much besides that. And that was really exemplified by the fact that there was a human engineer sitting at the board executing the machines that were suggested by the machines. Now, if we look at the cognitive sciences, we see a similar pattern emerging. We are interested in all of these different domains of human cognition, for example, decision-making, deliberation, exploration, causal reasoning, and many, many more. And to study these human cognition in these domains, what we typically do is we devise experiments that try to get at a particular aspect of human cognition. And then once we have these experiments, we collect human data. And once we have that data, we try to come up with theories or computational models that try to explain what people are doing in this kind of experiment, what cognitive processes they're engaging in, and so on. Now, the kind of knowledge that we get in this setting is that we understand quite well how human cognition works in the experiments that we are actually running. But we don't really understand well how it generalizes to the broader domains that we are actually interested in. And we pretty much have no idea how knowledge that we obtain transfers between all of these domains and how they are linked with each other. I think what we would rather have as a research paradigm, as a research program, looks something like this, where we try to build these unified models of human cognition that try to explain human behavior across all of these domains jointly. So I call these foundation models of human cognition in analogy to the foundation models that have become popular in the machine learning community in the recent years. And if we would have access to such models, that would, I think, be quite powerful, because that would give us much more robust and generalizable understanding about the human mind. Now, that is not a new thought that we want to have these models, has been recognized already for many, many years, dating back to the pioneers of cognitive science. So, for example, Alan Newell in 1990 already said that we need these unified theories of human cognition, because they are the only way of how we can bring this wonderful and increasing fund of knowledge that we have under intellectual control. Now, if you look at the statement here, that was made over 30 years ago, so quite a while back then. And it seems like we are still nowhere closer towards having these unified theories of human cognition. And that really raises the question, is there any way how we can make meaningful progress towards that? So it turns out maybe there's some inspiration that we can take from computer science. In particular, in the recent years, we have seen the emergence of a class of computational models that could be considered domain general, at least to some extent. Of course, I'm talking about large language models. So these are huge neural networks trained on vast amounts of text taken from the internet to predict the next word in a given text sequence. But what we observed in the recent years is, as we scaled up these models, is that they have many emergent abilities that go beyond just mere next word prediction. And modern large language models can, for example, translate between different languages, they can write computer code for you, or they can solve challenging reasoning problems. So a bit more than 2.5 years ago, started to wonder whether it's possible to take some of these models and place them in a psychology lab, run psychological experiments on them. Now, if that would be possible, that would be quite a powerful technique. For one, we could use it to understand how these black box machines reason, how they make decisions, how they integrate information, and so on. But maybe we could also find out that we already have built these unified models of human cognition by sheer accident, by just scaling up these next word predictors. So what we did is we tried this approach on back then the most popular model out there, GPT-3, or most powerful model out there, and summarized our results in a paper called Using Cognitive Psychology to Understand GPT-3, which is published in PNAS. And in this paper, we looked at how these models behave in different canonical psychological experiments taken from different domains, such as decision-making, deliberation, exploration, causal reasoning. So I don't have the time to go over all of these results today, especially because I want to talk about newer projects as well. But I still want to give a glimpse of how this kind of research that we conducted here looks like, because I think it also sets up nicely the stage for the later part of the talk. A particular domain that I want to look at is the study of how people, or in this case, computational models, solve the exploration-exploitation trade-off. In cognitive science, this is often studied in multi-armed bandit problem. An example that you are seeing here on this slide is a visualization of a two-armed bandit problem. So in these experiments, people have to repeatedly choose between two options. In this case here, the red option and the green option. And each time they select their option, they get reward feedback based on the option that they have selected. So we wanted to see, can we run these kind of experiments on GPT-3? The particular paradigm that we're using here is called the horizon task. It's a variant of a two-armed bandit task, where the decision maker first gets 4 forced choice options, in which essentially the decision maker is instructed which option to pick. And after these 4 forced choice options, there are either 1 or 6 free choice options, where the decision maker can freely choose what option to pick. So in order to run these kind of experiments on a language model like GPT-3, we constructed text-based version of these experiments, right? Because we cannot just give the visual input to a language model and let it solve the task. So we took this detour, creating these text-based version of it. Looks something like this. So it starts always with an instruction. In this case here, you are going to a casino that owns 2 slot machines, and you earn money each time you play one of these machines. Then we show a list of previously made observations. So in this case here, for example, machine F delivered $45, machine F delivered $41, machine J delivered $35, and so on. We instruct the model that the goal is to maximize the sum of received dollars. And in this case, we also give information about how many additional choices have to be made. In this case, only 1 additional choice. And then we ask it, which machine do you choose? And a language model would solve these kind of problems by simply completing the prompt that is shown here, either saying machine F or machine J. So we wanted to see how these models do these kind of tasks. So we ran it on the horizon task paradigm, and we computed how well these models perform and compared that to human performance. The plot here shows the results of this. In this case, performance is measured in terms of regret, which corresponds to the rewards that you failed to get. So lower regret means better performance. And you see both GPT-3 and humans are way better than chance. And it turns out, in terms of performance, they're actually pretty much indistinguishable from each other. Seems to indicate that GPT-3 is able to solve this kind of task fairly well out of the box without any additional fine-tuning, chain of thought reasoning, and so on. So based on these results, we wondered, well, what does the model actually do when solving these kind of tasks? Does it apply strategies that are similar to human strategies, or does it solve this task in completely different ways? So for that, we first looked at the behavior of the first free choice trial. So this is trial number 5, after you have observed, for examples of the task. In this case here, we look at a condition where you got 3 pieces of information from one of the choice options, in this case, the red choice option, and 1 piece of information from the green choice option. And if you have only 1 additional choice to be made, kind of the rational strategy that you should apply is compute some kind of expected values of both of these options, and then select the option with the higher expected value. And this is roughly what humans are doing, as shown in the plot on the right here. So on the x-axis, you have the mean difference in rewards, plotted against the probability of selecting the more informative option. In this case here, the more informative option is the one that has been presented fewer times during the forced choice trial. So in this case, the green option. And we see if the green option is better, we are on the right side of the plot here. People pick it more frequently. If it's worse, they pick it less frequently. People are, of course, also not perfect in this kind of task, right? Human decision-making is noisy. That's why you see the sigmoidal shape here. So I wanted to compare this to how GPT-3 choice curves look like. And when we plotted this, it looked something like this. Very different from humans. Turned out that GPT-3 has this very strong tendency to avoid the more informative option, the one that has been only presented once, has a strong tendency to keep repeating the option that it has seen more often in its context. Now here in this case, we can clearly see although overall, across the entire experiment, GPT-3's performance was pretty much indistinguishable from human behavior, or from human performance, its behavior looks vastly different how it solves these kind of tasks. We also looked at a second case where now same task, but now you have 6 additional free choice trials instead of 1. So in this case, computing expected values and selecting the better option based on that is not the optimal strategy anymore, but you somehow have to manage this trade-off between exploration and exploitation, right? It's maybe good to explore a bit in the beginning because that gives you additional knowledge that you then can use later on. And you can see that humans engage in this kind of exploration behavior. In this case, it's a form that is sometimes called directed exploration, where you see that their choice probabilities shift upwards when you consider these long horizon trials with where you have 6 additional choices. And they tend to pick the more informative option, the one that has been presented fewer times more frequently. In contrast to this, GPT-3 doesn't really engage in any meaningful kind of exploration behavior. Choice curves pretty much look indistinguishable if you compare whether they have only 1 additional choice to be made or 6 additional choices to make. So here again, we see, although performance is indistinguishable between humans and GPT-3, they solve these tasks in using vastly different strategies. So in the paper, we looked at a bunch of other domains: decision-making, for which we looked at risky choice problems; deliberation, for which we looked at a 2-step task; the exploration study that I've just presented, and we also looked at causal reasoning. And across these tasks, performance of GPT-3 was surprisingly good. Maybe that is a bit more accepted nowadays, that these models can just solve these kind of psychological experiments out of the box. But back then, when we first run these studies, that came like really as a big surprise to me, that you could just pick any experiment from the literature, turn it into text, give it to these models, and then actually do something meaningful. Like really, back then, models like ChatGPT were the first models that were even close to doing that kind of stuff. One notable exception is the causal reasoning setting, where the model completely failed, and I come back to that in a second. But then we looked also how similar does GPT-3 solve these tasks compared to humans. And we found in some cases there are some similarities, but also some differences. For example, in the case of decision-making, we found that these models have some cognitive biases that you can find in people, but there are certain biases that are present in people that are not present in these models. In the case of deliberation in the 2-step task, we found surprisingly these models engage almost exclusively in model-based reinforcement learning. So they really build a model of the world and use that to update their beliefs, which I found quite surprising, especially back then. In contrast to this, humans also rely on this kind of model-based reinforcement learning strategy, but they typically combine it with simpler model-free reinforcement learning strategies. And then in the cases of exploration and causal reasoning, we found the biggest differences compared to human behavior. And I think if we remind ourselves how these models are trained, that makes perfect sense, right? These models are just trained to predict the next word for a given text sequence, whereas exploration and causal reasoning are 2 types of paradigms that really require active interaction with the environment. And I think this mismatch between the objective that is used to train these models and what is required by the paradigm also explains at least part of why we see the biggest mismatch to human behavior in these 2 domains. So you might ask, well, that were studies done with GPT-3, that is by machine learning standards, an ancient model, over 3 years old. So what happens if you look at the newer models? Do they become more human-like? Maybe that could be the case, right? Maybe not so such a bad theory. But turns out they don't. There's by now a lot of studies that show that as we scale up these models further, they actually become less human-like. So for example, here's a study from Nature Computational Science, which shows that there are some cognitive biases that appear in reasoning of models like GPT-3, but they disappear again in the newer models like ChatGPT, GPT-4, and so on. Another study published at PNAS shows essentially these models become much more rational as you scale them up. So especially ChatGPT, GPT-4 are much more rational than people, and they lose a lot of the cognitive biases that people might have. So seems like simply scaling up these models will not lead us to getting these foundation models of human cognition that can explain human behavior, pretty much any kind of environment. So short interim summary before coming to the second part of the talk. I've shown that we can use these experiments from cognitive science to better understand large language models. We can use them to probe them, figure out how they solve certain tasks, and so on. These language models can surprisingly solve, solve, to at least my surprise, quite a lot of these experiments out of the box without any additional tricks or fine-tuning or whatsoever. But they don't always solve these tasks in human-like ways. But still, like taking this approach, like this cognitive science perspective to understanding these large language models, I think it's in general useful to and can give us hints to improve future systems. So, but now I want to come back to this idea of foundation models of human cognition, right? Shown these models, they capture really this feature that you can pretty much throw any problems at a large language model and it will give you meaningful responses. And that seems like something very much at the heart of human cognition as well, right? That we are general agents that can pretty much solve any task that you throw at us. So the question is, can we somehow take these models and align them with human behavior to get towards these unified models of human cognition? One obvious approach how you could do this is by fine-tuning them on human data. And in this context, I think psychology is especially relevant because in psychology, we have conducted an almost endless amount of experiments over the last 100 years. So in principle, we have collected so much human data that is ideal for doing these kind of analysis. But the problem is that all of this data is not readily available in a common format that you could just plug into a language model and fine-tune it on the data, right? It's like if you've ever worked with someone else's data, it comes in all these different formats, all these different structures. Some are MATLAB files, some are CSV files, whatever you can think about. So it's really not well-structured data. So for the project that I want to talk about next, we wanted to fix this and create the largest data set of human behavior in natural language form that is out there. And we did that by creating a data set that we called Psych 101 that includes natural language transcription of 160 psychological experiments. So it really reaches an unprecedented scale. The data set that we have created here contains records of 70,000 participants, making over 10 million human choices. And if you would translate that into text tokens, about 250 million tokens. And we tried to capture as much of psychology as we could, but initially we had to limit ourselves somehow. So currently most of the tasks are in the vein of decision-making, learning, so a lot of memory tasks, some supervised learning, multi-armed bandits, and then a few other ones. So the idea when we, here's one slide where I created a word cloud of the different paradigms that are included. I won't go into details about this, but probably you will recognize some of the names here. There's, for example, an odd one out task, decision from experience, risky choices, intertemporal choices, n-back tasks, and so on. I brought 2 examples of how individual data points in our data set look like, just to give a feeling for what we are working with. So the idea was we wanted to transcribe, or we wanted to create a natural language transcription of an entire experimental session by human participants that contained pretty much all the information that that participant received and produced in that single experimental session. So it always starts with the instructions, right? When the participant comes into the lab, gets instructions. Here, this is the task that you are doing. In this example, says that you are participating in multiple games that involve 2 slot machines labeled Y and Q. These slot machines are different across all of these games that you are seeing. Each time you choose one of the machines, you get points, and your goal is to choose the machine that gives you the most amount of points in each game. And then you see the data from the individual games. So here, this is again a horizon task paradigm, where it starts with these 4 forced choice trials. You're instructed to press Q and get 66 points, and so on. And then at the end, we see this one free choice trial. You press Q and you get 81 points. And that then we concatenate the entire history of the data that was produced by that participant. In this case, is an insanely long experiment, 320 trials. Must take forever to do this experiment. I'm happy that I didn't have to do it myself, but it's pretty cool data. Here, another experiment. In this case, it's an odd one out task. So you will be presented with triplets of objects. In each trial, you have to indicate what is the odd one out of these objects, and you do so by pressing the corresponding key. So individual trials look like this. You see a prune, nail polish, and a diskette. You have to decide which one. In this case, this particular participant decided that the diskette is the odd one out object. And then that essentially this contains the entire records of that individual participant doing this experiment. So we then wanted to take that data set and align an existing large language model to human behavior by fine-tuning it on Psych 101. We did that by taking the open source model Llama. In this case, we took Llama 3.1 in the 70 billion version. We fine-tuned it on Psych 101, and that led to a model that we called Centaur. We call it Centaur in analogy to this mythical creature that is half a human and half a horse. Really looking for a long time for something that is half human, half llama. Couldn't find anything, so we had to settle on some kind of nearest neighbor approximation with the name. And then we wondered, well, a few details on fine-tuning. I will talk about this on a rather high level, but essentially the approach that we are choosing is called quantized low rank adaptation. How this works is basically it takes a pre-trained language model, in this case a llama model, freezes all the layers of these models and quantizes them. And then instead of training these original parameters, it adds for each layer a few additional trainable parameters. These are called low rank adapters, and only these ones are adjusted on the data that during fine-tuning. This allows us to basically reduce the number of parameters that we have to train quite a lot. In this case, I think with our setting, it amounts to around 0.1% or something like that to the total number of parameters of the model. So we then wanted to take this model, our Centaur model, and try to see how well does it predict human behavior in experiments that were not part of the training data. And that's the main purpose here. We want to figure out how does the model generalize to new situations. So we set up a series of increasingly complex evaluations for the model. The first thing that we started with is we wanted to see how well does the model do on experiments that were part of the training data, but for new participants. We measure how well a model fits behavior of unseen participants using a pseudo R-square measurement. In this case, a value of 1 indicates that the model can perfectly predict human behavior. A value of 0 indicates prediction at chance level. So higher values indicate that that the model is better able to capture human behavior. And then we took our Centaur model that was obtained by fine-tuning Llama on Psych 101 and compared it against the original Llama model and a collection of traditional cognitive models that we took from the literature that were designed for specific experiments. So when you see cognitive model here, that corresponds not to one model, but that corresponds to one model that is designed for this particular experiment. Overall, what we found is that Centaur predicts human behavior better or much better than the original Llama model before any fine-tuning, and importantly also better than the traditional cognitive models taken from the literature. So indicating here, we really have this one unified system here that can predict human behavior better than the best existing theories that we have currently in psychology. This upper plot here shows average performance across all of these experiments, but then if you look at them individually, pretty much see a similar pattern. There's quite a lot of variance here. Human behavior is quite easy to predict in some of these experiments. It's much harder to predict in other experiments simply because humans are much more noisy in some of these. But overall, in pretty much all of the tasks, Centaur outperforms Llama and outperforms the traditional cognitive models in pretty much all of these settings that we looked at. We can also ask, well, what kind of factors influence whether Centaur fits human behavior well, and especially whether it fits human behavior better relative compared to the original llama model. In order to test that, we did a regression analysis where we try to regress different features of an experiment to the improvement of Centaur in terms of predicting human behavior relative to llama. And then on the left side here, you can see the different experimental categories that are included. So for example, decision-making, MDPs, memory, and so on. This really indicates that this improvement in goodness of fit to human behavior is not only present in one particular domain, but it's basically consistent across all of these domains. And then we looked at different properties of the prompt and how they influence the improved goodness of fit. And for this, we looked at the number of participants that we had for one particular experiment. We looked at the number of choices that participant did in this experiment, and then the number of text characters in the prompt. And here we only found that only the number of participants had a significant effect on this improved goodness of fit. And I think that is quite a nice result because it really indicates that the important thing here is that you get a lot of diverse data from a lot of different participants. It's not so important that you have a lot of data from one participant, but for this approach to work well, you need to have a lot of data from a lot of different participants. Everything so far that I've shown was essentially the model trying to predict one human choice conditioned on the entire history of choices that that participant has made in the experiment. But we can also ask what happens if we want to run these models in an open loop fashion, right? Let it generate its own predictions and then feed these predictions back into the model. So really generating behavior in a fully self-governing fashion. Are these models also, if they operate in such a mode, similar to human behavior? So what we did in this setting is we simulated Centaur in an open loop fashion and then computed different statistical properties of the trajectories that were generated and compared these against trajectories that were generated by humans. Plot here shows 3 examples of this. On the left, we see an example from a 2-step task, in the middle from a horizon task, and on the right from a grammar judgment task. On the x-axis, you always see performance of the model in this particular experiment. And on the y-axis, you see different properties that we obtained by looking at the fitted parameters of traditional cognitive models to the trajectories generated by the respective agent. I won't go into all of the details here, but I want to highlight one interesting thing about the first plot. So this is from the 2-step task. We see that the model, the statistical properties that come from trajectories generated by the model overlap fairly nicely with those generated by humans. Like in performance, they roughly match, and also they cover the whole spectrum of behaviors that Centaur can produce, right? We see sometimes the model produces trajectories that are purely model-based. Sometimes it produces trajectories that are purely model-free. What I said should be the other way around, but then also everything in the middle can be generated as well. And it's kind of nice because it indicates that we're not creating a model that gives us the average participant here, but we are really modeling the distribution over trajectories that can be generated by the entire population. So there is a lot of individual differences already present in these kind of models like Centaur. Then we wanted to ask, well, what we're really interested in is how far outside of the training distribution can Centaur generate human-like behavior? So we set up a bunch of evaluations to test this in increasingly complex out-of-distribution evaluations. The first thing that we wanted to look at, what happens if we change the cover story? Is the model still able to produce human-like behavior? For this, we looked at data from a 2-step task experiment. So in this kind of experiments, participants start an initial state here. They can choose between 2 options, in this case, the red option and the blue option. They land in the second state where they have, again, choice between 2 options. They pick one, they get a reward, and then the whole process repeats. This is a fairly common paradigm in neuroscience. I'm sure many of you know it. And the canonical cover story that you find in the literature is that participants are told that they are taking a spaceship, traveling to foreign planets in search for treasures. And this kind of experiments with that kind of cover story are also part of our training data. But recently, there have been also people that propose different cover stories. For example, here, this cover story that involves magical carpets from a study from Fer da Silva and Hara, where you take a magical carpet, you travel to Pink and Blue Mountains. On these mountains, you encounter genies that you can then ask for wishes. So we wanted to see, and importantly, Centaur does not include any experiments on a two-step task with that cover story in its data set, right? Only includes experiments with that spaceship cover story. So we wanted to see, can it generalize in predicting human behavior in the magical carpet cover story version of the two-step task? So plot here shows results of this analysis. Oh yeah, sorry. Was there a question? I guess not. I will just go on if that's a question, let me know. So plot here shows again pseudo R-square values. I apologize, it's not labeled on the y-axis. So higher means the model is a better fit to human behavior. And on the x-axis, you see the different models. You see Centaur, you see Llama, so the original model before any fine-tuning, and you see a cognitive model that was handcrafted for this particular domain. And we see Centaur is again the best model at predicting human behavior, outperforms both Llama and traditional cognitive model in this experiment, even though that experiment was not part of the training data. So it indicates at least it can generalize even if you change the cover story of the experiment. We then looked at a second setting where we wanted to test something a bit more complex. We wanted to see what happens if you change the structure of a task a bit. Can Centaur still generalize to predicting human behavior in that setting? Our data set that we use for training, the Psych 101 data set, contains a lot of two unbanded problems that I talked about in the beginning, but we purposely left out any experiments that involve three unbanded problems. So we wanted to see, can Centaur predict human behavior in three unbanded experiments? And for that, we used the data from a study by Dubois and Hauser. This is a paradigm that's sometimes called Maggie's Farm. Maybe some of you are also familiar with that kind of study. So similar picture again, pseudo R-square values plotted on the y-axis. Higher means better fit to human behavior. We again see Centaur is better at predicting human behavior than Llama model without any fine-tuning, and domain-specific cognitive model that was handcrafted for this domain. So indicating that it's not only robust to changes in cover story, but it can still predict human behavior even when you modify the task slightly. Now, the ultimate test, however, is, does it generalize to entirely new experiments that were not even part of the training data? So we also wanted to test this. And for this, we looked at the study that tested people on logical reasoning problems. So our data set, like 101, doesn't include any type of logical reasoning problems, but it contains, of course, problems that maybe are somewhat similar to logical reasoning, right? Like you could say that in these risky choice problems, also on logical reasoning plays a component, but it contains no explicit logical reasoning problems. So we wanted to see whether Centaur can capture human behavior in such a setting. Same plot as before. So in this case here, we again see Centaur predicts human behavior quite well, outperforms Llama model again without any fine-tuning. And in this setting here, we don't have any cognitive model because none of the tasks in the training data are similar to the data that we are testing on here, right? So we were not really able to compare against the traditional cognitive model. Cool. So let me see how I am on time. Okay. So everything I said so far was kind of, we looked at how well Centaur captures human behavior from a quantitative perspective. But we might also be interested in how does that look qualitatively? Is it similar to that? And in order to test this, we exposed Centaur to a recent benchmark that we have proposed called Cogbench that can be used to measure the cognitive abilities of large language models. Setup looks similar to the things that I've talked about before. We took 7 experiments from the literature, translated them into a text-based form, and then we fit different cognitive models on behavior on agent that do these experiments. And that gives us for each agent a vector of 10 behavioral metrics that kind of like capture the cognitive phenotype, so to say, of a particular model. And we can then do this for many different LLMs. We can compare it to humans and see also for Centaur, how does it compare qualitatively to human behavior. The plot here shows essentially the overall results. On the x-axis, you see the different 10 behavioral metrics that are part of this data set. So for example, this includes how much do these models engage in metacognition, how model-based they are, how risk-taking they are, and so on. And on the y-axis is the parameter value for this given behavioral metric, where we normalize these parameter values such that the value of 1 corresponds to a random agent, and the value of 0 corresponds to a random agent, value of 1 corresponds to the value that humans would have in these kind of tasks, or the average human, I should say. And we see when we compare Centaur to Llama, we see that in pretty much all of these metrics, Centaur becomes more similar to humans when you compare it with the original Llama model without any fine-tuning. In each of these cases here, you see the purple line moving a bit closer to the human value of 1 if you compare it to the pink bar. You can also visualize that in a more low-dimensional space and compare it against a bunch of other models. So here we took this 10-dimensional matrix and applied multi-dimensional scaling to it, and then plotted 2 dimensions. In purple, you again see the Centaur model. In pink, the Llama model. Gray is the human cognitive phenotype. And then I plotted a bunch of models for reference, like different GPT variants, different Claude variants, and so on. We see that even also in this kind of qualitative comparison, Centaur becomes more human-like, and this is also the most similar model to human behavior in all of these, according to these metrics. So lastly, we wondered what happens internally to these models, right? Everything so far that I talked about was about their behavior, but we can also study what is going on internally in these models and ask, do the internal representations of Centaur become more aligned to human neural activity? So we wanted to test this in using simple linear decoding. So how this works is we again create our text-based version of an experiment. In the first example that I've shown, this is again the 2-step task. We show this task to Centaur, extract its internal representations. We show the same task to people, measure the fMRI activity, and then we try to see how well can we predict human fMRI activity based on the internal activations of the model. And this prediction here is happening using just a simple linear transformation in our case. So the setting that we look at this is again 2-step task using this magical carpet story that I've shown before. Plot here shows the result of this analysis. So the y-axis shows how well can we predict human behavior using the internal activations of the model, measured using a R-square measurement. So higher means we can predict human neural activity better. And the x-axis shows representation, doing this analysis for representations extracted at different layers of the model. We see Centaur is constantly, or the representations of Centaur are constantly better at predicting human neural activity compared to the representations of Llama. So that is quite exciting. Even though we trained the model only on human behavior, we still find that even its internal activations align more with human neural activity. And we also see that if we do the same analysis with a traditional cognitive model, so this is a simple reinforcement learning model that combines model-based and model-free reasoning, we don't really get any meaningful signal here, really indicating that we need these large-scale models like Centaur to even think about these kind of analysis. So we repeated this in a second setting where we took data from Greta Tukut et al., where they conducted a study where they simply let people read simple 6-word sentences, like the ones shown here, right? We are sitting on the couch, this is a beautiful picture, and so on. And while people read these sentences, they get their fMRI activity recorded. And we repeated the same analysis again, now this time on these kind of stimuli. Plot here shows the result again, similar to what we have seen before. So on the y-axis, R-square measurement, indicating how well you can predict human neural activity using representations extracted from the model, extracted at different layers shown on the y-axis. And we see even here in this setting that Centaur improves on predicting human neural activity when we compare to Llama. Now here in this case, the improvement is quite small. It's just a few percent. But I think this is still quite exciting because this is really a true test for the model's generalization abilities. The stimuli that we are shown here in this experiment are really far away from the training data of Centaur, right? This was mostly cognitive experiments, versus here, people just read simple sentences. And then also, we never trained the model to capture human neural activity, right? We only trained it to capture human behavior. But still, even in settings as far removed, we see somewhat of an improvement. So let me wrap up this part. So I've talked about Psych 101. It's a novel large-scale data set of human behavior that we have created, really reaches an unprecedented scale. I think moving forward, that will be a super valuable resource for both machine learning, but also for scaling up our theories of human cognition. And then we use this data set to create Centaur, which in our opinion is the first real candidate for a unified model of human cognition. Centaur can predict behavior of holdout participants doing the same experiments that are part of the training data. It also generalizes to new experiments. It's robust to changes in cover story, to structure modifications, and even in entirely new paradigms. And then I've shown also that the internal activations of Centaur become more aligned with human neural activity when it trained on behavioral data that's produced by humans. And I'm quite excited about this model because I think there are many direct applications where such a model is useful. All right. For example, you can imagine that you use it for in silico prototyping of behavioral studies. So even if before you run your study in the wild, you can test it on Centaur, see what comes out of that. You can use the results, for example, to estimate power, to figure out how many participants you have to collect, maybe to improve your experimental design, and so on. I think the model is also useful for human-computer interaction if you want to simulate humans in such a setting, or it can be used for automated cognitive science. And I think there's almost no limit to situations where such a model that is able to predict human behavior quite well will be useful. So, but coming back to the original motivation that I gave in the beginning, right? Newell said he wanted to have these unified theories of human cognition because they will be immensely useful for advancing our field. But what we have here currently with Centaur is kind of only a proof of concept that we can discover these unified models of human cognition in a data-driven manner. Like we have a model that can predict human behavior quite well, but it doesn't really fulfill this role of a theory yet that allows us to explain what we are doing. So the question is, is there like a way how we can close the gap? And I think there are a bunch of obvious directions. One is, for example, you can now take this model, apply tools from explainable AI, for example, from mechanistic interpretability to understand what is going on in these models internally, and then use the resulting insights to generate new hypotheses about human information processing. So for example, you could imagine applying techniques such as attention map visualization, where for a given transcript of a session from one experiment, at each point in time, you could look at how much does this particular participant pay attention to things that has happened in the past. What, for example, does the participant pay attention to in the instructions? How does it pay more attention to recent rewards and past rewards and things like that? You can also imagine that you can use tools such as sparse autoencoders to kind of interpret what kind of computations are going on in these models. For example, you can imagine that you apply these techniques to figure out whether a particular neuron in a particular layer is responsible for a certain concept. And then you can see what kind of concepts are activated in a given sequence. For example, you could give such a prompt to these tools, and then it would tell you, hey, this is a high performance participant. It applies a strategy that corresponds to an upper confidence bound algorithm, and so on. So really like almost automating this pipeline of analyzing what people are doing in a particular session. Another approach would be to say, well, Psych 101 is already so large that we don't only can use it for fine-tuning language models, but we can actually use it to train models from scratch. And if that is possible, we can basically do cognitive modeling at a totally new scale across all of these different domains. We can more and more build like ideas from cognitive science into these large language models and figure out what kind of theories do we need to best capture human behavior. Bunch of obvious examples. You can, for example, test whether human memory is more like a transformer or more like these models, such as recurrent models that maintain a vector-based memory. Do you need to implement more sophisticated memory structures, long-term memory, semantic memory, and so on? Or you can ask whether adding certain planning components to these models helps to make them more human-like. And I think that is quite exciting because we couldn't do these things before, but with the data that we have transcribed here, I think we are a big step closer towards doing that kind of stuff. And I'm mainly interested in using these kind of tools to figure out how human cognition works. But there's also, I think, a chance that we can use results that come out of this kind of research to inform new machine learning architectures. So lastly, I want to say that we are currently, or we recently started to extend the Psych 101 dataset that I talked about before and want to create an even larger dataset. The idea is kind of, hopefully we can reach a size that is a 10-fold increase over Psych 101. This is like an open research collaboration. So there's a GitHub repository that you can find when you scan this QR code or just when you look at our paper. And if you have any experimental data that you think could be interesting to have in this data set, you are very welcome. You're invited to contribute it. The idea is kind of to write this up as a paper, probably for next NeurIPS dataset and benchmarks track, and then have all people who have contributed data as co-authors on this eventual paper, similar to what the machine learning community did with their big bench dataset. And my hope is that we can also, when doing this, broaden the scope of the domains that are included in this data set and include a bunch of new things. For example, studies from psycholinguistics, social psychology, economic games, many, many more. And also, I want to have studies that focus on individual differences. For example, studies from developmental psychology, computational psychiatry, studies that involve questionnaires, and all of these kind of things would be really exciting to have. So if you think you got something that could be suitable for this, check out the corresponding link. With that, I think I'm pretty good on time. Yeah. I want to thank you for your attention. Thanks to my collaborators for their work on this. Really, this is a really large-scale project with over 40 people that would not have been possible without the help of my lab and all the other people involved. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcel. It's very impressive talk. So we have several questions on the chat box, so you probably want to take it.
Perfect. Should I read them, or do you want to read them out loud?
Yeah, you can just read them aloud. Probably, yeah.
Okay, I start with the first. Did the order of tasks used for fine-tuning matter? So we didn't study this, but I would assume that like structuring these tasks in a particular sequence would probably not work so well, simply because when you train these neural networks using gradient-based methods, that assumes that your data set is IID distributed, and then once you add structure, stuff gets complicated. So I would assume the naive approach of simply shuffling the data, what we did, would work best. But then again, I think what is maybe interesting is figuring out other ways how you could structure this. Yeah, I think there's in general, a lot of ways how the fine-tuning that we did could be improved. Okay, so next question is, does Centaur consider human individual differences in predicting holdout participants? Good question. The answer is, I would say yes and no. Basically, what the model does not contain any direct mechanism to capture individual differences, right? It's the same model that's predicting every participant. What, however, can happen and how the model has a chance to capture individual differences is if it, within its context, sees a bunch of example decisions of a participant has made. For example, you have these 50 risky choice problems where you saw, hey, this particular participant has this and this pattern when making their choices. And then, of course, the model can catch up on that and use this information to make better predictions about this particular participant in the future. Yes, so yes and no, I would say. I should also say that the cognitive models that we have looked at in this don't have any mechanisms for capturing individual differences. We always put these models on a population level, and we didn't include this kind of like in-context adaptation in them, simply because there's no known method to easily do that. So in that sense, the comparison that we do to these traditional cognitive models is a bit unfair, you could say.
So if you have any questions, you can just unmute yourself and directly ask Marcel.
Yeah, so thank you for the great talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I have a question regarding, in general, the idea of improving the prediction accuracy of those models on human behavior and neural activity. So you mentioned that you would like to scale up the size of the data set so that I imagine that you will perform better there. But do you think it is also necessary to kind of improve the architecture of those models to make it more human-like in some sense?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think especially when you want use these models as tools to understand human cognition, I think that will become very important that you also consider the architecture, because I would assume that different architectures are best provide different fits to how well they capture human behavior. So in that sense, if you think about them as cognitive models, definitely. If you think about them purely as prediction machines, maybe given that everything we know from now, you're just fine using a big black box transformer model.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So currently it seems like transformer-based models are dominating the language models and everything. So, but maybe there could be a next generation model that can be more human-like and more intelligent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
So Marcel, I've got one. Oh, okay, so please.
Oh, sorry. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, perfectly.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Michelle, for the really great talk. And I just have one question. Actually, I noticed that in the Psych101 database, there is one memory data set. I think it should be, because I have read the paper, I think it should be the MBAC data set.
Yep.
So yeah, something like for human participants, they are presented with a lot of items one by one. And then a participant just need to judge whether an item is the same as the one 2 trials ago, something like that. But I'm not sure what this means to the large language model, because for the large language model, they can use all the text information before, and I'm not sure why the large language model can predict the performance in this task better than the cognitive model for human beings.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I think I agree that this format, especially for these kind of memory tasks, when you give them to a language model, feels very unnatural, right? Because the model has the prompt right in front of it. It can just look up what needs to be looked up and then solve the task.
Yeah.
But then I think what happens during fine-tuning is that it will learn to do so not perfectly and learn mistakes that are structured in similar ways to how human mistakes are structured, right? And I think especially for the NBAC task, the difference between the cognitive model and the Centaur was not so big, but there was a small difference, if I remember correctly, which indicates that there are some structured differences, structured patterns that are present in humans or in Centaur that are not present in these traditional cognitive models, right? So essentially the model learns to, when you fine tune it, learns to make the same mistakes as people do, even though it could look up everything.
Yeah, so I just want to
thanks.
say a little bit something on this. Actually, I have a paper on studying the working memory capacity of large language models using the NBAC task. If you're interested, you can check out that. The title of the paper is just the working memory capacity of ChatGPT and empirical
feel free
study.
to send me, would be quite interesting.
Yeah, okay. I can put it in the chat, and yeah, if people are interested, you can also read. Thank you.
I think a continuing question from Dr. Hu is just, does all of the tasks in the training or center matter? I mean, makes sense for human cognition. For example, I noticed there's some tasks like go or no go task. But if I remember that correctly, it's kind of like perceptual task, right? But in the prompt, you only give the choice history. So I'm not sure if this kind of fine tuning is always makes sense, for human cognition in the task.
There's definitely, so ideally what I want to do is I want to train these models on the exact visual information that people get as well, right? Just like it's not possible to, even if you have a lot of manpower like we had in this project, it's like simply not possible to reconstruct all of the experimental stimuli that people saw. So there are experiments where the loss of information is maybe more severe than in other ones. And I think the go-no-go task is maybe actually a good example because also it's such an easy task. People are very deterministic in their behavior. But then what's typically being studied are reaction times, right? But like basically right now, we don't care about reaction times at all. So there is definitely a mismatch, and some tasks are more unnatural to think about than others. But I still think all the tasks that we transcribed, I think in principle, you have similar information to people doing the experiment. So when there were visual stimuli, we described the visual stimuli, right? Like, oh, you saw a green circle or so.
Yeah. Do you think deleting some of the tasks could better, further improve the center performance? I mean, sometimes you may have the
performance
problem
in terms of predicting
yeah, I mean,
behavior,
removing some of the tasks, in the training set, because sometimes you may encounter the overfitting problem. Actually, it's, for example, in go or no go task, if you have no visual input, it's just learning about something like the action bias or somehow learning bias, right? But it's actually, we discovered that from human cognition, but it's actually that the main behavior should depend on the visual input. But probably when the model learns about that bias, and it might be able to transfer to some other learning task or sequential decision-making task, and probably that kind of bias does not make sense in other contexts. So probably removing some of the task could probably further improve the task.
I think that is very likely that some of the tasks are not so representative of what humans are doing, especially when you take this format into consideration. So I think it's definitely possible that if you remove some tasks, it would get better.
Yeah.
There's one raised hand from
Ed.
Thanks, Marcel. Very impressive. I'm just out of curiosity. So at the beginning, I can tell that you have the ambitions to study the unified cognition, and then you showed us this impressive performance from the Centaur, which basically outperform other large language models, the LLMR, and also those hand-made cognitive models. So do you think this implies that the unified human cognition is transformer-like, follow a transformer-like architecture or something else?
Yeah, I wouldn't say so probably. I would say more like the transformer architecture is expressive enough to capture human behavior. But I think drawing the conclusion that it is, I think we don't have good evidence for that yet, right? I think for that you would need to compare to a bunch of other architectures trained on the same data set and compare these models like you would compare traditional cognitive models against each other.
Okay, so just continue our discussion. And have have you compared to other, for example, those RNN-based or long-term short-term memory models?
Not yet, but it is on my list. So I think the problem here is also when you want to fine-tune a language model, simply most of the good ones are transformer-based, right? So if that is the approach that you are taking, you don't really have to access to, let's say, RNN-based models. Maybe the situation is changing slowly, so maybe soon as possible. But I think for now, you can only do these kind of studies once you look at whether it's possible to train models from scratch on this data set. And we haven't done this yet, but I think that is next on the agenda.
Okay, I see. Thanks for your answer.
Thanks for the question.
Hi, Marcel.
Hello.
Thank you for the great talk. I was just particularly interested in how you think of the fact that human has like somewhat draw system, like the system 1 versus system 2, like thinking fast and slow, and people may behave differently under and without time pressure like this.
A second, let me stop sharing maybe. Can you repeat the last part of the question?
Oh yeah, it's just so basically there's a non-standing theory about how humans think maybe in 2D systems. So one is fast and it's like intuitive. The second one is more like reasoning. Do you expect to find that dissociation in large language model? Or
Yeah, so we haven't studied this like really thoroughly in our paper, but I guess there's maybe one piece of evidence that would hint towards this is basically this one plot where I showed that when you simulate Centaur in an open loop without any human conditioning on human behavior, you sometimes get trajectories that are purely model-based, sometimes that are purely model-free, and then also a combination of those. So that would indicate that these systems also implement a combination of system 1 and system 2 reasoning. But I think, yeah, we haven't looked at this like really closely.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? All right. So thank you, Marcel, and thank you everyone for coming today.
Thank you for the invitation.
It's very excellent talk. And I believe everyone, if you are interested in Marcel's Site 202, right? 201 or 202? The new data set
201,
contributes. Yeah, 201.
You
So I will just copy the
in the
GitHub
paper
page.
or on my GitHub.
Yeah, I will copy the GitHub page for contributing your data set. So I mean, this would be going better and better with your contributions.
Yeah, cool. Thanks you for the invitation. Thanks for all the good questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Marcel. See you everyone.